Hello, and welcome back our channel tonight. Before we wander through the past, take a slow breath. If you enjoy long, quiet stories where history feels alive, stories that feel like candlelight instead of textbooks, press subscribe to follow and get more videos from us. It's free, and it keeps these night walks going. I hope you enjoy. Now, settle back. Let's go to Florence. The city doesn't sleep, it sighs. Even at midnight, you can feel it breathing warm air spilling from windows, faint laughter from taverns, and the low hum of the Arno River moving like time itself. The cobblestones under your feet still hold the day's heat, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear the footsteps of centuries, the shuffle of merchants, the click of a noblewoman's heels, the soft tap of a monk's staff. Florence in the Renaissance was a paradox wearing perfume. It was the city of saints and bankers, of marble and whispers, of art so divine it felt dangerous. But what made Florence truly remarkable wasn't just its paintings or palaces, it was the way it learned to weaponize emotion. Here, love itself became a kind of politics. Not the romantic love we dream of, the messy, heart-fluttering kind, but a colder version. A love measured in contracts, dowries, and reputation. In Florence, the word amore could mean alliance. A kiss could seal peace between feuding families. A marriage could end a war faster than an army. Under the candlelit ceilings of Florence, the Medici family perfected this art. They understood that hearts were the softest targets. You can fight a man with swords, but you can own him with affection. And in a city where everything was recorded, debts, confessions, even flirtations, love became both a currency and a confession. The night smells like stone and honey. You walk past the Palazzo Vecchio, where power lives behind thick walls and patient smiles. Inside, the council meets beneath frescoes of virtue and victory, debating taxes, laws, and who gets to marry whom. You might think that decisions of the heart were left to priests or poets. Not here. Here love was audited. Picture a father sitting by the fire, pen in hand, writing a letter not to his daughter, but to the banker who guards her dowry. He writes not of affection, but of arithmetic. Her beauty is collateral. Her smile, investment. Her silence, a line of credit. The banker replies with the tenderness of numbers, and the contract grows, signed, stamped, sealed in wax. That's love in Florence. Outside, the streets belong to everyone else. The artists, the gossipers, the servants who know too much. Behind shutters, someone whispers a prayer for a husband's temper to soften. Across the square, a merchant's son slips a poem under a window. But he's not really declaring love. He's negotiating visibility. To be seen by the right person, in the right place, meant a future. Florence was full of watchers. Every step, every glance mattered. A dropped fan could start a rumor. A shared glance could end a reputation. A simple bouquet might whisper the wrong intention. And so, love wore masks. Polite smiles in daylight, secret letters at night. People learned to fall in love like spies, carefully, cautiously, knowing that affection could save or destroy them. Imagine a wedding in the heart of the city. Lanterns hang between balconies, their lights soft as butter. The air smells of almonds and wine. Laughter ripples through the crowd, but beneath it runs something quieter, a current of calculation. Two families clasp hands. Coins change pockets. Blessings are whispered like insurance policies. The bride lowers her gaze. She knows her new husband's heart doesn't belong to her. It belongs to the deal. But that doesn't mean she's powerless. Florentine women, limited by law but rich in intuition, learned to turn affection into leverage. They could bend outcomes with kindness, plant rumors like seeds, and navigate rooms where men thought they ruled. A letter written in a trembling hand might outwit an entire council. A smile at the right feast could make a banker generous. Love was their language of survival and sometimes revenge. Inside the palaces, paintings told the same story. A Venus holding flowers wasn't just beauty, it was propaganda. A Madonna with downcast eyes represented virtue that reflected well on the patron's wife. Even the brushstrokes were political. Botticelli's soft lines could flatter a reputation better than any treaty. Florence was in love with its own reflection. It worshipped beauty, not because it was pure, but because it was persuasive. Art became the city's mirror, showing it what it wanted to believe, that love and goodness were twins, that power could be noble, that wealth could be romantic. But underneath the perfume, something darker stirred. Behind every marriage contract was fear of scandal, of betrayal, of being left outside the circle of influence. And fear, when dressed in lace, is indistinguishable from devotion. If you were to stand in the Piazza della Signoria at dawn, you'd see it clearly. The statues, Hercules, David, Perseus, heroes frozen in triumph. But each of them carries the same secret. Every victory here required charm before blood. Even the myths understood Florence's truth: love first, conquest second. You pass a street musician playing a slow tune. He sings of courtly love, of knights and ladies. His voice floats like incense. But in Florence, the songs weren't just romantic, they were political commentary. They mocked affairs, praised alliances, and hinted at scandals too dangerous to name aloud. People dropped coins not just for melody, but for information. Now, look up, see the windows. They hide the city's real history. Behind them, love was plotted, traded, betrayed. Somewhere, a wife writes a letter to her husband in exile, swearing fidelity while arranging his pardon. Somewhere else, a young painter immortalizes his patron's mistress under the guise of mythology, both flattered and doomed. In Florence, nothing stays secret, but everything pretends to. You walk across the Ponte Vecchio. The bridge glows with its usual chaos: goldsmiths closing shutters, merchants counting their blessings in coin, lovers leaving behind glances instead of gifts. The river below catches reflections, lamps, stars, and the faint image of a city that wants to look holy while dreaming of power. That's Florence. Half prayer, half performance. A soft breeze carries the smell of wine and ink. Somewhere, someone is writing a sonnet. Not for love, but for survival. Because in this city, words could shield as much as swords. A poet who pleased the right patron could feed his family for years. One careless metaphor, and he could lose his tongue. Florence taught Europe that love was an art form, but art here was never free. It served someone's ambition, someone's family, someone's future. And so the story begins, with a city that believed affection could be shaped like marble and signed like a document. A city where I love you meant I'm aligned with you. A city that painted its heart gold and its intentions invisible. The moon slides down Brunelleschi's dome. The bells hush. The last laughter fades. In the distance, the sound of hooves, the night courier from Rome, carrying new orders, new scandals, new chances to fall in love strategically. This is Florence, a place where every heart beats behind a locked coffer, and every vow is written in invisible ink. Now, before you rest, imagine this. What happens when love leaves the chapel and enters the counting house? When priests and bankers start speaking the same language? Tomorrow, we'll open the ledger of affection itself, the dowry, where every heart comes with a price tag and every promise earns interest. The sun rises over the Arno like a coin rolling off a banker's desk. For Florence, dawn is not about renewal, it is about accounting. The city wakes the way a merchant opens his ledger slowly, line by line, balancing night against day. Somewhere, a rooster calls. Somewhere else, an abacus clicks. And between them, the first prayers rise with the smell of ink and hot bread. Here, affection begins with arithmetic. Every father with a daughter thinks in percentages, not poetry. He knows that her dowry, the money and goods she brings to her husband, will decide not only her comfort, but her family's reputation, alliances, even salvation. Love in Florence is built on ledgers, and behind every marriage lies a contract as complex as a treaty between nations. Walk with me into the Monte delle Dotti, the city's famous dowry bank. Its facade looks modest, but it hums with quiet desperation. Inside, men in long robes bend over parchment, recording futures. The air smells of parchment, beeswax, and a hint of sweat, the scent of trust strained thin. A father approaches the counter with a purse of coins and a hopeful smile. He deposits money for his daughter's dowry, locking it in until the day she marries. If fortune favors her, she will wed soon. If not, the city keeps the interest, and her worth grows on paper while her chances shrink in life. The Monte delle Dotti was supposed to protect women, to ensure that even if a husband died or squandered wealth, his widow could survive. But like most good intentions, it became a tool for strategy. Families used it to display status. A large deposit meant stability, and stability was sexier than charm. A suitor would glance at a girl not for her smile, but for the number scrawled beside her name in the city's record. And so, Florence turned love into a kind of lottery, where affection was the prize, but mathematics sold the tickets. Imagine a father and son in the same room. The father counts florins, the son counts glances. The father calculates alliances, the son imagines poems. One speaks the language of interest rates, the other of infatuation. They are both Florentine. They are both correct. Because here, romance must pass through the bank before it passes through the heart. Outside, matchmakers walk the streets like diplomats. They carry tiny notebooks filled with names, ages, family crests, and financial evaluations, each line a potential treaty. They whisper in courtyards, at church steps, in market stalls between cabbages and gossip. Her dowry includes silver from Venice, one says. His uncle has a share in the wool guild, replies another. Deals begin where eyes meet, but they end where ink dries. For women, the dowry was both armor and chain. It could grant safety and widowhood, but it also marked them as commodities. To love freely meant to risk becoming worthless. So they learned subtlety, the art of influence that hid behind lace veils and lowered eyes. A word placed with the right priest, a favor offered to a banker's wife, a discreet gift at a christening, these were their investments, as real as any coin. Meanwhile, Florence's poets romanticized it all. They wrote about chaste devotion and divine love, using words so delicate they almost erased the contracts beneath them. But behind those verses stood the scribes of the Monte delle Dotti, keeping the city's pulse steady with ink. Even Dante, who wrote of Beatrice with sacred awe, lived in a society that priced virtue by the ounce. Walk past the market at San Lorenzo. Here, love smells like oranges and raw wool. Women haggle for cloth while keeping one ear open for news of engagements. A butcher's wife boasts that her daughter's betrothal is nearly confirmed. A painter's sister laughs softly. Her own dowry is smaller, but the groom is kind. Kindness, though, is an unstable currency. It doesn't accrue interest. Listen to the merchants. They speak of silk, but they mean daughters. They trade fabrics, but they barter futures. A single bolt of velvet can mend a quarrel. A miscounted chest can end a friendship. Somewhere in all this commerce, real affection still flickers fragile, like a candle in a draught, but it rarely survives the counting. At midday, the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore toll across the city. Inside the great cathedral, light filters through stained glass like liquid jewels. A wedding mass begins. The bride's veil trembles. The groom's expression is dutiful. Behind them sit rows of relatives, accountants, and potential investors, each measuring the ceremony in silent sums. The priest blesses the union, but the true sacrament happens afterward, in the signing room, where notaries dip their pens and merge fortunes as cleanly as names. In a corner, an old man mutters, "Every love ends with a ledger." No one disagrees. Still, Florence pretends. It loves to pretend. It dresses its pragmatism in poetry, its ambition in lace. After all, illusion is the city's most enduring export. Artists learned this faster than anyone. They painted devotion so convincingly that the whole world believed in it. But they also knew a portrait could flatter a patron's wife, mend a political rift, or disguise an affair. Every brushstroke was both affection and advantage. You step into a painter's workshop. The air smells of linseed oil and ambition. A half-finished canvas shows a couple gazing heavenward, their fingers barely touching. The painter explains, their families hate each other, but the Pope requested harmony. He smiles, dips his brush, and adds a halo where there was once suspicion. This is how Florence reconciles opposites, with pigment. By evening, the city softens again. Lanterns glow, barges drift, lovers walk the bridges. And beneath the quiet beauty, the same machinery hums. Even when the stars come out, the dowry banks don't sleep. Clerks write by candlelight, ensuring that no affection escapes without documentation. In Florence, even passion needs a receipt. One might ask, did anyone love without calculation? Yes, but quietly. A servant girl who gives her heart to a painter, knowing he can offer nothing but music. A widow who sends a loaf of bread each morning to a friend she cannot visit. A poet who writes verses for a married woman, knowing they will burn unread. These small rebellions keep the city human. They are flickers beneath marble facades, little flames the wind cannot entirely smother. As night deepens, a banker locks his chest. He smiles to himself, satisfied that both his daughter's futures are secured. Across the street, a tailor finishes a wedding gown for a girl who will never see it again, her match cancelled by rumour. And somewhere near the Piazza della Repubblica, two lovers meet behind a curtain of vines, whispering words they cannot afford to mean. Florence, for all its beauty, is afraid of genuine love. True affection resists balance sheets. It cannot be leveraged or mortgaged, and anything that cannot be measured terrifies a city built on commerce. So it invents structures, contracts, dowries, banks to tame the unpredictable. But the heart, inconveniently, refuses to stay tamed. If you stand by the Arno tonight, you might hear both languages, the one of money and the one of longing. Coins clink in purses, water murmurs secrets. Somewhere, a young man composes a love letter on borrowed parchment. He signs it with trembling care, then hides it in a hollow wall. He knows it may never reach her. He also knows it doesn't matter. To write, to feel, to risk, these are his own small revolutions. Florence taught Europe to count affection, but what it never managed to count was the cost, the quiet ache behind every arranged smile, the tension between survival and sincerity. The Monte delle Dotti still stands, its archives full of names once spoken in tenderness. Each entry begins with a promise and ends with a signature. Between them lies a story that no accountant ever balanced. We'll leave the bank and step into the palaces, into the Medici courts, where love becomes policy and flirtation rewrites history. Because in Florence, every embrace has witnesses and every vow has clauses. Florence wakes like a stage crew pulling ropes behind velvet curtains. From a high window, a servant opens shutters, and sunlight slips in gold on stone, warm on secrets. In the Palazzo of the Medici, breakfast smells of cinnamon and calculation. No family in Europe mastered the art of love as politics quite like them. They built their empire on wool, banks and charm, and when charm failed, they painted it gold. If the rest of Florence played with affection as a social currency, the Medici turned it into foreign policy. Cosimo de' Medici, the quiet founder, once said that money was like blood, it must circulate to keep a body alive. Love worked the same way. Each marriage, each friendship, each whispered favour kept Florence breathing. And if the pulse faltered, you sent a gift, a painting, a poem, a dowry, a bride to get the flow moving again. Picture the Palazzo Medici on an ordinary morning. Courtiers drift through corridors like perfume. Scribes deliver letters wrapped in silk. Lorenzo, later called the Magnificent, dictates his correspondence between sips of honeyed wine. His words are soft, but their meaning is hard as marble. He writes to a duke in Naples, "Our friendship is most precious to me, as is your son's happiness. I hear your daughter has grown wise and lovely." It sounds like warmth. It is actually a trade route. That daughter's hand could secure peace, cancel debts, or open the ports of Pisa. The Medici didn't seduce with armies, they seduced with alliances. Lorenzo understood the city's bloodstream better than anyone. He knew which families still resented old insults, which ones feared excommunication, which painters owed favors, which friars had gossip worth gold. And he learned early that people forgive betrayal faster than they forgive boredom. So he made every negotiation feel like theater. Imagine him hosting a banquet. Music echoes beneath frescoed ceilings, silver gleams, laughter flows like wine. But every smile is strategic. Each seating arrangement is a sentence in a story only he can read. A rival placed beside a poet to soften him with compliments. A bishop beside a banker to remind them that heaven and interest rates are not mutually exclusive. Somewhere near the end of the table, two young people glance at each other, a pairing orchestrated weeks in advance. Florence adored Lorenzo because he made ambition look like generosity. He gave dowries to poor girls as acts of civic virtue, but each one strengthened loyalty. He sponsored artists not out of charity, but out of foresight. A painting in a rival's home could be a spy with brushstrokes. The Medici discovered that art could do what armies could not make people want to obey. A fresco could teach a city to dream in the right direction. A statue could define what virtue should look like, and a wedding, if planned correctly, could disarm a generation. Even their enemies understood it. The Pazzi family, fierce and proud, watched in frustration as the Medici expanded influence not through soldiers, but through smiles. They tried steel. Lorenzo replied with serenades. He danced through politics like a man who knew the tune ahead of time. But behind the velvet and verses was a manual not written, but understood. It went something like this. Rule 1. Never let love stand alone. Every affection must serve purpose. Even kindness must have an invoice. Rule 2. Keep friends close and their daughters closer. A marriage can fix what a treaty cannot. Rule 3. Patronage is seduction. Give artists glory, and they'll make your image immortal. Rule 4. When in doubt, host a feast. Wine loosens pride. Pride loosens tongues. Rule 5. Never fight what you can romance. A man flattered is a man disarmed. Under these unspoken commandments, Florence thrived, glittering, contradictory, alive. But every rule comes with a cost. One afternoon, Lorenzo strolls through his garden, past orange trees heavy with fruit. He stops to watch a young sculptor chip marble into a figure of Venus. The sculptor works slow, reverent, as if freeing love itself from the stone. Lorenzo smiles and murmurs, "A little less divine, perhaps, more human. People trust what they recognize." The boy nods and softens the goddess's mouth, giving her a mortal warmth. That small correction that humanization becomes the Medici hallmark. Love, real enough to feel, unreal enough to control. Down in the city, the technique spreads. Every merchant becomes a miniature Medici. They learn to phrase affection like investment. Weddings become mergers. Compliments become currency. Florence becomes a chessboard of hearts. Amid the grandeur, cracks appear. In a dark chapel corner, a friar named Savonarola begins to preach about corruption. He warns that the city's beauty hides sin, that its paintings seduce the soul from God. People listen, at first amused, then uneasy. He accuses the Medici of using art the way a spider uses silk to trap. He isn't wrong. Lorenzo hears of him, smiles sadly, and sends a gift, a new robe, fine cloth from Lucca. It is both apology and warning. Love, even divine love, must play by Florentine rules. Meanwhile, in quieter rooms, the Medici women play their own games. Clarice Orsini, Lorenzo's wife, writes letters full of affection and advice. She negotiates favors, protects allies, scolds reckless nephews, all in the language of family. Her ink carries diplomacy disguised as devotion. She knows that in Florence, the only thing more powerful than a banker's promise is a mother's letter. When Lorenzo dies, the city mourns as if beauty itself has dimmed. But beneath the black veils, people count what remains. Debts, alliances, betrayals postponed. The Medici machine still turns. Love, once their softest weapon, has become Florence's instinct. Every citizen has learned the choreography: a little flattery, a little faith, a little fear. The irony is perfect. In trying to control affection, Florence made itself addicted to it. Now, no decision feels safe without sentiment attached. No policy feels real unless it is wrapped in tenderness. Stand in the piazza today and you can still feel it. The air tastes of charm, sweet, persuasive, faintly exhausting. Florence seduces even its historians. But power that charms too well begins to blur into illusion. And illusions, once they slip, expose the hunger beneath. You wake to a pale fog lifting off the Arno, the kind that quiets hooves and softens voices, and the city rises with it, stretching its many hands. Painters unlatching shutters, poets clearing their throats, merchants testing scales that will soon weigh more than fruit. Yesterday, power smiled from banquet tables and called it friendship. Today, power borrows a brush, a rhyme, a melody, and teaches the city to feel in the right direction. In taverns that still smell of last night's wine, verses are already rehearsing themselves. A poet wipes the rim of a cup and recites lines that sound like worship, but move like arrows. The lady in the poem is pure light, he says, and those who stand near her are made better by reflection. He does not need to say her name. Everyone understands the geometry. Praising her lifts her house. Lifting her house obliges their allies. Obliging their allies presses down on rivals who suddenly find their shadow a little longer. The poem will be sung again in a courtyard at noon, then again in a salon where a banker's wife smiles and says nothing at all while her eyes take notes. This is how affection travels, tied to meter, disguised as innocence. In a narrow lane that smells of wet stone and flax, a boy carries a board primed with gesso toward a studio where dust dances in a cone of winter light. The master is shaping a goddess who was asked to look both celestial and domestic, the kind of divinity a patron's household can live with. The figure's mouth is softened, human, her eyes tilted down as if listening rather than commanding. The master says he was told the painting is a wedding gift. Flowers for fertility, a canopy of myrtle for fidelity, Mercury turning away clouds because peace must be presentable. The painter places a hint of blue near the shoulder, ground from a pigment that costs more than most men's lives, and the room goes quiet with the knowledge that virtue has a price and someone has paid it. When this canvas is hung above a bed, it will preach more efficiently than any priest, and no one will call it a sermon. Outside, a troupe strings garlands across a street, rehearsing a pageant for the Saints' Day that is also, conveniently, the day two houses will walk arm in arm to the same altar. Boys dress as winged heralds. A cart is fitted with a painted backdrop where chastity triumphs over pride. The message is a lace glove over a clenched hand. Spectators will laugh and clap and repeat the lines over supper, and the city will agree, collectively and without paperwork, on who sinned and who forgave. Music does the heaviest lifting. The chorus is simple, the kind that stays in a body like warmth. Even those who despise the sponsors will hum it on the way home. In the market, rings shaped like clasped hands glitter on a cloth, and a merchant says they were blessed this morning, though the blessing you actually buy comes from the name stamped in tiny letters on the inside. Metal, refined through a network of men, loyal to a family that knows how to convert affection into interest. Two girls try them on and laugh at how their fingers look older with jewelry, then lower their voices when a widow walks by. Her gown is simple, her veil darker than the day requires, and the stall owners move their wares aside to make a path. Her husband's death would have left her empty-handed in another place, another century. Here, there is the dowry bank, and behind it a ledger that remembers her when no one else does. But remembering has also cost her. Suitors speak to her as if she were a contract that might default. She learns to answer in the same language, phrases that promise stability, faces that promise calm. Grief has made her persuasive. Poetry is not the only script that shapes the hour. In the workshop near Santa Croce, a cassone, a marriage chest, lies open on trestles, its inside painted with a story of patience rewarded. The bride will keep linens inside it, and on ordinary mornings when the house is loud with small tasks, she will glance at that painted scene and accept the lesson without resentment. The painter is young and hides a darker shade under a bright glaze, a small swathe of night beneath a field of spring. His master notices and tells him weddings are not for doubts. The boy nods and leaves the shadow there anyway, a thumbprint of honesty varnished forever into someone else's instruction. Toward the river, a man lifts a lute and plays a tune written by a patron who knows that jokes are sweeter than warnings. The lyrics dance at the edge of mockery, celebrating the harmless pleasures of festival, while handing the listener a pocket-sized opinion about austere friars who scold. People laugh, and their laughter becomes complicity. The friar's next sermon will land on a softer surface. Someone tosses the musician a coin, and for a moment, the coin's arc looks like a thread pulling corners of the city together. Music can do that. Tie rooms to streets, streets to bridges, bridges to banks, banks to kitchens where women sing the same melody while folding bread. By sunset, the whole city will have learned the refrain. That is the point. Not far away, a letter is being written at a small desk near a warm brazier. The writer is a woman whose pen does not tremble because she has learned to be precise. She thanks a cousin for helping arrange her niece's match. She praises a certain family's discretion. She mentions softly a rumor that threatens to spoil what generosity has begun. Each sentence carries two meanings, the one on paper and the one intended. Men boast of treaties, women choreograph them. The letter will travel in a pocket sewn inside a cloak and arrive before supper, where it will be read aloud with the same expression one uses in prayer, a face that shows nothing and hears everything. In a chapel lit like a bowl of honey, a patron kneels and prays in front of a panel he paid for last winter. The Virgin's robe is the deep blue that signals uncompromising devotion and exceptional credit. The donor's wife appears discreetly at the bottom of the scene, her hands folded in a pose that tells the city she knows her place, and that her husband is a man who keeps the divine close without flaunting it. A merchant steps into the chapel, makes the sign of the cross, and clocks the details as if scanning a bill of lading. Color, quality, iconography, the painter's hand. He leaves with the taste of piety and the certainty that if a dispute arises between his warehouse and the donor's ships, God will already prefer one of them. It is not that the artists are cynical. Some are. Most are tired. They know the difference between the moment lightning passes through the hand and the moment a patron asks for more clouds because a cousin objected to the sun looking so assertive. Still, even commissioned beauty retains a charge. A face suddenly becomes too human on the canvas, a gesture too tender. A poet allows the ending to ache instead of resolve. The city forgives these impurities because they keep the illusion believable. The audience needs to glimpse a pulse beneath the brocade. Without it, the pageant would feel like a sermon, and sermons are easy to ignore. At midday, the bell from the cathedral pours down the streets like water, and everywhere hands pause, at looms, at counters, at sleeves held steady for a pin. In a courtyard shaded by an orange tree, a man of letters repeats a stanza to a circle of listeners who pretend to be accidental. He has written about a pair of doves who cannot fly apart because the string tied to their feet is the same string that holds a city together. The metaphor is generous and cruel. Someone claps first. Someone else repeats the final line with just enough approval to send it moving outward. By dusk it will be a saying, and by next week it will be an opinion. And in a month, it will be a memory that never admits. It began with a man whose rent was paid by a banker who prefers metaphors to laws. Inside a dim shop that smells of glue, a gilder lays gold leaf onto a frame with a breath so gentle it seems like prayer. He has heard the rumors about the painting this frame will hold. A bride noble in patience, a groom depicted as justice made gentle, two families braided by a ribbon of virtues that the painter borrowed from an emblem book. The gilder does not care about any of that. He cares that the leaf lies flat, that the seam disappears, that when the object hangs on a wall, every eye in the room will agree at once without knowing why. Agreement is the true commission. The rest is decoration. Late afternoon bears the city's bones. Shadows stretch, secrets lengthen. In a cool loggia, a group of young men practices a small play they will perform from a wagon. One is dressed as Prudence, another as Charity. They laugh when the mask slips. Then they straighten, rehearse again, and Charity learns to walk with her chin lowered at the exact angle that tells the crowd she approves of a recent reconciliation. The boy beneath the mask grins toward a girl at the edge of the square who claps too quickly. Her father notices and will speak to her about it later in a tone that carries the weight of mortgages. Across the river, a studio door stands open to let Varnish breathe. On a table lies a portrait, the sitter's gaze slightly off-center in that carefully learned way that seems modest but claims the room. The painter has tucked a sprig of rosemary into the border. Remembrance, fidelity. Because rumor has been particularly cruel this season. The husband, on seeing it, will feel both comforted and guided. His wife is steadiness. Anyone who says otherwise opposes virtue itself. A small plant painted well can do what tender Niles cannot. Evening draws a shawl over rooftops. Lamps bud along streets, and voices take on the softness people use when they want to be believed. A seller of sweets calls out a rhyme that children will repeat tomorrow when they play in alleys. Sugar for brides, almonds for harmony, cinnamon for nights when the heart chooses silence. Mothers smile at the line and remember the nights when silence was not choice but courtesy. They were taught and they teach. The city carries knowledge like a river carries light, changing it, breaking it, making it manageable. Somewhere, a friar writes a sermon that will thunder against these disguises, warning that painted love is still temptation and sung forgiveness still a sail. His quill scratches anger into neat Latin that will be translated into Tuscan with all the splinters retained. He is not wrong, but neither is the city that replies with a festival float shaped like a boat named Concord, crewed by children with wooden oars. The argument continues in procession, each side generous with certainty. There are private moments the spectacle cannot reach. A servant girl pauses at a window and watches a boy across the lane wash his hands at a basin, fingers red from dyeing wool. He looks up as if smelling her glance and does not smile, which is better than smiling, because it means he knew she was there before his face performed it. She will carry that fact to sleep like a charm. No poem will mention it. No painting will hang it over a bed. Yet this too directs a life. Tomorrow, she will choose a slower path to market to pass that window again. And along the slower path, she will hear a piece of news that arrives in her mistress's house before any letter. Love provides intelligence no guild could purchase. In a quiet room washed with lamplight, a mother trims a ribbon and places it in a small wooden box that already holds a lock of hair, a prayer card, a list of names to whom she owes bread and a favor. The box is nothing, and it is an archive of decisions. She will open it tomorrow when the matchmaker comes, and close it again when the door shuts, and in the meantime, a painter will keep scrubbing at a stubborn passage of green that won't sit right, and a poet will remove an adjective, because the family it describes paid for the noun. Night finds the city relieved and restless. The way actors feel when the curtain falls, but the mask string still marks the skin. Somewhere, a musician with sore fingers counts coins and worries he has praised the wrong man too loudly. Somewhere, a printer saves an extra proof of a poem because he recognizes the sound of something that might last longer than the man who paid for it. Somewhere, a girl in a house that smells of fennel and soap leans a mirror against the window to catch the moon in its surface and practice a face that will be remembered as serenity. She is 12. She is learning quickly. If you stand on the bridge and let your palms rest on the cool stone, you can feel the city thrum. It is not the thrum of armies or decrees. It is the pressure of small arts doing large work, paintings that steady a conversation, verses that tilt a vote, pageants that fold an insult into a parade and walk it through a crowd until the insult forgets itself. Everyone participates. Everyone pretends they are only appreciating beauty. Beauty is agreeable. Agreement is profitable. Profit is safety. Safety, at last, feels like love. But even here, where the mechanisms are polished and the disguise is masterful, there are costs that do not appear in ledgers. An artist swallows a compromise and cannot paint for a week. A poet avoids a friend because the next stanza will be cruel and commissioned. A woman listens to a song that names her as a parable and hears herself becoming furniture. The city requires these expenditures and does not apologize. It points to its churches, its hospitals, its scholars, its bridges, and says, "Look what we built." It is not bragging, it is asking to be forgiven. The bells mark the hour. The fog returns from the river with the soft insistence of a memory. You can almost imagine the city exhaling, loosening its laces, laying its scripts aside for a few breaths. A child cries, a dog answers. A man in an upper room coughs, in the way winter makes men mortal. The noises are uncomposed, and for a moment they fill the space normally reserved for meaning with something simpler, life arriving and departing in ordinary measures. When morning comes again, the poets will polish their lines, the painters will lay another thin skin of light over what light has already tried to do, and the musicians will carry a tune from one doorstep to another until it belongs to everyone. The soft war will continue without uniforms. It will look like generosity, sound like courtship, taste like almonds and clove, and leave behind the faintest residue of discipline disguised as delight. And then there are the rooms where the city's most careful negotiations occur, where no painter's ladder reaches and no chorus intrudes, where a glance across a table does more than any letter sealed in wax. Those rooms belong to women who have learned the city's grammar and can bend it without breaking it, turning sympathy into shelter, patience into leverage, and tenderness into law. Tomorrow, if you're quiet, you can stand in the doorway of one such room and watch how the heartbeat of Florence is regulated not by councils or altars, but by a hand that pours wine at the right moment and says the right word as if it were merely kindness. The morning after a festival, Florence wakes with the perfume of crushed flowers still clinging to its stones. Garlands hang limp from balconies. Wax drips harden on cobbles. The air tastes faintly of smoke and honey. Servants sweep confetti into piles that look like discarded promises. The pageant of virtue has ended, but its message lingers in the bruised petals. The city's order, like beauty, depends on rehearsal. Behind shuttered windows, the real work begins again. The quieter trade of affection for security. In a house overlooking the Arno, a woman sits at her dressing table while her maid combs her hair. Each stroke releases the smell of rosemary and oil, and in the mirror the lady practices a smile that forgives before it condemns. She will need that expression before midday. A cousin will arrive to speak of alliances, and every word will sound as though it were about affection while meaning property. She knows this language by heart. Her husband calls it prudence. The friar calls it duty. She calls it survival. Her maid, younger, hums a tune from last night's procession. She thinks of the boy who handed her a sweet when the crowd surged, their fingers touching for an instant. The memory burns brighter than the morning sun, though she would never call it love. In Florence, love is what people in frescoes have, something clean and still. What she carries in her chest feels less like an angel and more like a spark that refuses to die. She hides it because sparks are dangerous in houses built of silk and fear. Across the river, a scribe copies letters for men too important to write their own. He sharpens his quill with care, knowing the difference between a compliment and a confession lies in the thickness of a line. Today he is copying a sonnet, said to be inspired by divine beauty. He suspects the poet owes money to the subject's father. The lines are careful. Virtue rhymed with mercy, mercy with debt. When the ink dries, the scribe reads the poem aloud to himself, tasting the rhythm like a secret prayer. He wonders if anyone truly believes these words, or if belief itself has become a kind of profession. At a convent near the city walls, nuns chant in the chill chapel. The sound rises like breath against stone. Among them is Sister Lucia, who once danced at court before her family decided humility was safer than attention. She has been asked to illuminate a new manuscript for a wealthy widow. Verses on chastity shaped like a mirror. As she paints the border with gold leaf, she catches her reflection in the polished edge and almost laughs. Outside these walls, men trade indulgences and call it grace. Inside, she paints virtue as though it were a possession. She dips her brush again and whispers a single rebellious prayer, that God sees through compliments. Near the cathedral, a merchant counts his earnings from the festival. He sells perfume distilled from imported resins and swears each bottle contains a promise. One vial he keeps for himself, marked only with a small letter L. It is a blend made for a woman who once refused him politely. He tells himself it was the perfume's fault, that she was overwhelmed by holiness that day. Tonight he will unstopper the bottle, breathe in the ghost of her answer, and remind himself that wanting something noble can make even rejection feel virtuous. Desire repackaged as devotion. Florence has taught him well. In the courtyard of a modest house, a girl named Isabetta kneels to wash linen in cold water. Her mother watches from the doorway, spinning thread. The daughter hums the same tune the maid hummed earlier across the river, and the mother hears danger in it. She speaks softly. Songs travel faster than sense. Isabetta nods, but keeps the melody low, imagining the soldier who smiled at her during the parade. He had a scar near his mouth that made every grin look like a secret. She repeats his face in her mind until it becomes a story she can own. A small rebellion against the tidy marriages her parents discuss when they think she is asleep. Meanwhile, in the palace above them all, the Duke's advisor dictates a letter to a bishop. The words are velvet, sheathed over iron. The city's virtue, the necessity of alliance, the blessings of affection correctly directed. He signs with a flourish that means power disguised as courtesy. When the wax seal cools, he sits back and wonders if God ever tires of being cited as witness in human bargains. Then he remembers the last man who asked that question aloud and decides silence is the safer hymn. As afternoon stretches, Florence smells of bread and ink. Love continues its quiet labor. A painter leans close to a commission, a portrait of a young couple promised in marriage. He softens the wife's gaze until it meets the viewer's with perfect obedience. Behind her shoulder, he places a window opening toward a calm sea, a symbol of fidelity. He knows the husband wanted mountains there, strength, endurance, but the painter prefers water. Water reflects and conceals. Water rewrites the sky. When he finishes, he steps back and feels a flicker of guilt, because he has painted the bride to resemble the woman he once courted in secret. The resemblance is faint enough to pass unnoticed, but he knows. Art keeps its own confessions. Evening approaches. Lamps glow behind iron grills. Voices thicken with wine. In a narrow alley, a troupe of actors performs a farce about a jealous husband. The audience laughs too hard, which means they recognize themselves. Between the lines of comedy lies instruction. Suspicion sustains authority. When the play ends, couples walk home arm in arm, quieter now, considering which laughter was theirs and which was the play's. In a small bakery near the square, a widow counts coins and studies her reflection in the oven's polished door. She once thought grief would free her, but freedom is expensive and rarely paid in advance. Suitors have begun to circle again, men who praise her piety as if it were a dowry. She has learned to answer praise with silence, silence with warmth, warmth with distance. The rhythm feels like prayer, though she no longer knows to whom. At the same hour, a young scholar pores over a volume of Ovid in a candle's sputtering light. He copies verses about love as conquest, annotating them with careful Latin glosses. To him, affection is a discipline, a weapon of syntax. His patron expects a commentary that praises chastity. The scholar intends to show how restraint itself can become domination. He will hide his meaning beneath allegory, confident that only those who deserve to understand will. Night folds the city again. Behind heavy curtains, negotiations of affection resume. A noblewoman writes a letter in careful script, thanking a rival for her recent kindness, which every reader will interpret as warning. She sprinkles a pinch of lavender over the parchment so that even suspicion will arrive perfumed. Her husband sleeps beside her, dreaming of applause. Beyond the walls, the Arno glimmers under a crescent moon. The river has watched these exchanges for centuries, carrying away the words no one dared speak aloud. It knows the city's secret arithmetic, how one touch can equal a treaty, how a sigh can cancel an oath, how love, when wielded with precision, can reorder an empire without raising its voice. Somewhere in the dark, a bell tolls the hour, and a woman pauses mid-sentence at her embroidery frame. The thread trembles between her fingers like a question. She does not answer it. The city has taught her that silence, too, can be a weapon, and tonight, she chooses silence sharp enough to cut through dreams. Dawn returns to Florence on slippered feet. The sky above the dome shifts from violet to gold, the kind of light that pretends nothing has been conspired in its absence. Bakers lift shutters, doves settle on ledges. The river resumes its endless rehearsal of forgiveness. What the city plotted under candlelight now steps politely into daylight, disguised as duty. Inside a narrow house near the Via Calzaiuoli, a letter lies open beside a bowl of pears. It was written last night, folded twice, then unfolded again when courage hesitated. Its ink now smells faintly metallic, like regret. The woman who wrote it studies her handwriting as though it belonged to someone else. Each word is a small rebellion softened by courtesy. I trust your discretion. I pray our intentions remain blessed. She knows what she means, and she knows what he will read. Meaning, like perfume, changes once released into air. Her husband enters, adjusting his cuffs. He praises the quiet, unaware that quiet has teeth. She nods, pours him wine, and thinks of the man who will receive her letter before noon. A poet with too many debts and just enough charm to make loyalty sound like art. The affair will not last. Affairs never do. But in a city where love is a form of currency, sometimes one must spend affection to buy freedom. Across the square, an apprentice sweeps dust from a studio floor. His master sleeps at his easel, a smear of vermilion drying across his thumb. The boy has begun to notice how commissions shift with gossip. A patron's niece smiles in public, and suddenly the Virgin in the next painting looks suspiciously like her. He wonders if saints ever tire of being used as disguises. When the master wakes, he will speak of light and harmony, of the divine proportion. The boy will nod, then glance at the unfinished canvas and see only strategy. At the Duomo's steps, a friar preaches against vanity. His voice cracks like a whip above the crowd, denouncing silk, painted faces, songs that seduce. Yet his gaze lingers on the women in the front row, longer than doctrine allows. He speaks of pure love, of heavenly affection, and every listener hears something different. A sinner's threat, a lover's plea, a husband's warning. The sermon ends with applause disguised as repentance. By afternoon, the same crowd will hum a tavern song built from his very words. Florence always edits its morality to a better melody. Down the street, two merchants share bread and rumours. One claims that a certain noblewoman's smile has cost a banker his fortune. The other laughs, saying fortune has many names and all of them begin with opportunity. They raise their cups to her invisible health, calling it admiration. But admiration, in this city, is simply envy pretending to have manners. In a small courtyard, a young couple meets under the pretext of returning a borrowed book. The woman wears gloves despite the heat. The man's hands shake as he passes her the volume. Inside the cover, he has hidden a note folded into the crease. 3 lines that say everything and nothing. She will read it later behind a locked door, trace his name with her fingertip, and feel both foolish and alive. Tomorrow she will burn it because evidence is heavier than guilt. Even the children understand the script. In the streets they play at weddings, assigning roles with solemn faces. Bride, groom, priest, dowry. When they run out of ribbons, they use threads pulled from their sleeves. Their laughter fills the alleys, bright and temporary. Somewhere, A mother watches and thinks of her own ceremony years ago. The smell of lilies, the weight of gold on her neck, the way her husband's hand trembled, not from passion but calculation. She wonders when play became tradition, and tradition became obedience. In a quiet study, an aged philosopher dictates a treatise on love. He insists that true affection purifies the soul, aligning it with divine order. His secretary, young and restless, nods and writes, while secretly sketching hearts in the margins. The old man believes reason can govern desire. The young one knows reason merely follows it, limping behind like a loyal servant. When the treatise is published, patrons will quote its maxim during banquets to sound virtuous, never realizing the words were born between boredom and longing. At twilight, the city changes color again. Terracotta bleeds into shadow. Gold leaf turns to dusk. Lovers appear where light fades fastest: doorways, bridges, cloisters. Each tryst is a negotiation, each sigh a signature. In the gardens of the Medici villa, laughter echoes among cypresses. Behind it lie whispers about alliances sealed not by ink but by skin. Power drapes itself in passion. Passion excuses power. Both believe they have conquered the other. By the river, a fisherman watches lanterns flicker on the water. He hears music from distant windows and mutters that even the rich must sing to forget themselves. His wife sits beside him, mending a net. She says nothing. The silence between them is honest in a way the city above them no longer remembers. In a workshop nearby, a sculptor chisels marble late into the night. Each strike releases dust like breath from stone. The figure he shapes is of Venus, but not the idealized goddess his patron demanded. This Venus looks tired, her beauty edged with sorrow, as if she understands the price of being adored. The sculptor does not intend rebellion. He simply cannot lie convincingly anymore. When the work is unveiled, the patron will call it bold. The city will whisper dangerous. Before dawn returns, Florence sighs once more into stillness. The letters are delivered, the beds cooled, the prayers murmured half in guilt and half in gratitude. The river carries the city's reflection without judgment. Love, ever patient, sharpens its blade again, ready for another day's performance. Evening drapes itself over Florence like velvet soaked in amber. The day's heat retreats into courtyards and cellars, leaving the air sweet with spent perfume and dust. Bells toll from Santa Maria del Fiore, each note trembling as though the city were exhaling its own sins. Those who spent the day pretending virtue now walk home through alleys scented with figs and smoke, rehearsing innocence for whoever waits behind their doors. In a room above a weaver's shop, candles gutter against a draught. A woman sits before an embroidery frame, her needle darting in and out of linen with quiet precision. Each stitch is a word she cannot speak, each color a feeling she has learned to bury. Her husband sleeps in the next room, dreaming of trade routes and profit. She dreams differently. Once she had painted, until the family decided paint was not for respectable wives. Now she builds small gardens of thread, where desire hides under petals. She tells herself it is harmless, but each flower blooms a little brighter than decency allows. Down the corridor, a servant listens to her humming and wonders if beauty itself is a kind of treachery. She remembers what the friar said last week, how Eve's curiosity doomed mankind, and decides curiosity is the only thing worth keeping. Later, when the house sleeps, she will sneak to the kitchen and read the merchant's discarded letters by firelight, tasting the forbidden pleasure of another person's secrets. Elsewhere, a scholar paces his narrow chamber, restless beneath shelves of manuscripts. His study of Plato's Symposium has led him to dangerous conclusions, that love, far from divine, is the most efficient way to enslave a mind. Tonight, he tests the theory. He writes a note to a woman of higher station, clever, ambiguous, filled with half-meanings, and sends it by his page. By morning, he will have an answer that reveals whether intellect can tempt as effectively as charm. In Florence, philosophy and flirtation share the same grammar. In a quiet cloister near San Marco, Sister Beatrice kneels before a crucifix, whispering prayers that begin as confession and end as poetry. Her abbot calls it fervor, She calls it hunger. When she paints miniatures for the convent's breviary, she gives her angels mortal faces, the curve of a lip she once saw at the market, the eyes of a mason who repaired the chapel roof. Each figure is a memory disguised as holiness. She wonders if God recognizes himself in these portraits, or simply forgives her for needing to see him in familiar form. At a palace supper, laughter glitters like the cutlery. Courtiers lean close to exchange compliments polished thinner than gold leaf. Across the table, a young poet entertains the duchess with a sonnet about chastity. Everyone hears the double edge in his rhyme. The duke smiles indulgently, believing the flattery his due, while the poet imagines the duchess's pulse beneath her pearls. The game is old, older than scripture. To speak desire so cleverly that virtue mistakes it for praise. Later, in the courtyard, torches sputter and musicians tune their lutes. The poet slips away to a balcony overlooking the river. The duchess joins him briefly, her perfume clinging to the air like another listener. They say little. She traces the railing with her gloved finger. He watches the movement as though memorizing a verse. The city below hums with its 1,000 conspiracies, and in that moment, they are merely another stanza in Florence's endless poem about love dressed as diplomacy. At the same hour, a physician closes the shutters of his study. On his table lies a letter sealed in black wax, addressed to a woman he once courted before her marriage to a magistrate. He should burn it, but instead, he reads it again, searching for what he meant. It speaks of affection, gratitude, divine order, but between the lines, shame throbs like a pulse. He knows she keeps the letter locked away. He imagines her touching it as she prays. In treating others, he has learned the body's secrets. In losing her, he has learned the soul's weakness. Meanwhile, the city hums with gossip disguised as devotion. At every fountain, women draw water and trade stories of who fainted at mass, who lingered too long at confession, whose lace came from a forbidden source. Each rumor polishes Florence's mirror until it reflects only what the teller wishes to see. Reputation here is an art form delicate, profitable, lethal. By midnight, the streets grow hushed. The painter from the last part sits alone in his workshop, a single lamp illuminating the half-finished portrait of a noble couple. The husband's hand rests possessively on the wife's shoulder, but her eyes tilt ever so slightly away toward an invisible horizon the artist cannot name. He leans close, adjusting a line, and realizes the woman's expression mirrors his own fatigue. A beauty built to please, crumbling beneath the weight of expectation. He dips his brush again, darkens the background, and thinks not for the first time that the truest things in Florence are the mistakes left visible. At dawn, the Arno glows the color of pewter. Fishermen push their boats into the current, children chase the fog, and the city wakes to another day of decorum. The woman with the embroidery hides her latest piece beneath a stack of linens before her husband rises. The scholar receives a reply. 3 words that could ruin or redeem him. The poet revises his sonnet, softening the irony. Sister Beatrice finishes her angel's face and lowers her brush with a sigh that sounds suspiciously like relief. Florence breathes again, a sigh shared by sinners and saints alike. Love sharpens its edges under the morning bell, ready for new disguises. The city will call it virtue, as it always does, and everyone will nod, pretending not to feel the blade's gentle press against the heart. The air that morning felt almost too clean, as if the rain had tried to wash away more than dust. Florence gleamed under the sun, roofs rinsed, courtyards glistening. To any passerby, the city looked reborn. But those who lived inside its walls knew that purity was only another mask, one freshly painted over cracks that had started to widen. In the Palazzo della Signoria, clerks sorted through petitions for pardons, dowries, and debts. One sheet among them carried a stain the color of rust someone's thumbprint pressed too hard. It was from a merchant who had accused his wife of betrayal, not of the body, but of the heart. He wrote that she had whispered too kindly to another man and therefore weakened his honor. The magistrate, reading the plea, sighed. Honor was Florence's favorite disease. It infected every household, spreading through glances and laughter, carried on perfume and rumor. In this city, to love the wrong way was to invite exile, but to love the right way could make you powerful. The line between them was as thin as gold leaf. On the Ponte Vecchio, jewelers opened their shutters. The first customers came not for trinkets but for messages. A clasp meant "I forgive you." A ring with twin doves meant "I still watch you." Beneath the polite chatter of trade, secrets changed hands. The city had perfected a system of silent communication. The merchant's daughter, who walked past in a blue veil, was not merely fetching silk. She was delivering a confession folded in her glove. The apprentice who slipped a coin into a baker's palm was paying for more than bread. He was buying silence. Love had become a language of gestures, one Florence spoke fluently. At noon, a meeting took place in the private room of a convent. Sister Beatrice, who had painted too many angels with human faces, now found herself called to confession by the abbess. A letter had arrived anonymous, of course suggesting that her latest illumination contained the likeness of a man. The abbess questioned her gently at first. Why had the angel's eyes been so dark, so earthly? Beatrice hesitated, then told the truth too softly. Because heaven feels far, mother, and the world is near. The abbess sighed. She would have to send the sister away for a while, to another convent in the countryside. Exile disguised as rest. Beatrice bowed her head, knowing that art had betrayed her better than any lover could. In the painter's quarter, the master who had created the weary Venus finished his sculpture. It stood in his studio like a confession turned to stone. Patrons came to see it and argued in whispers. Some called it genius, others blasphemy. When asked what it meant, the sculptor only said, "It means she's tired." That was true of the statue and of Florence itself. The city's beauty had begun to exhaust its own believers. Elsewhere, a poet performed his latest work in a candlelit salon. He spoke of love as both blessing and bondage, his verses threaded with irony so fine that half the listeners applauded and half turned pale. A young woman in the audience, married to a banker, twice her age, felt her pulse rise with every line. The poem spoke directly to her, though the poet never met her eyes. Later, she would commission a small painting of Saint Cecilia for her husband's study, a token of devotion. In its corner, the painter would hide a subtle detail. The saint's hand clutching not a palm of martyrdom, but a small sharp key. By dusk, Florence seemed calm again. But calm here meant tension balanced perfectly between pleasure and fear. Candles bloomed in windows. Lovers met in doorways with practiced discretion. In one of those doorways stood the young scholar who once tested whether intellect could seduce. The experiment had worked too well. The woman he wrote to now sought him openly, risking her reputation for a mind that made her feel visible. He had not expected to win, and victory frightened him. For the first time, he saw the cruelty of his own cleverness. He told himself he would end it. But love, once loosed, has no leash. Farther along the river, an older couple argued behind shutters. Their son had joined a brotherhood promising to cleanse the city of vice. The father called it foolish zeal. The mother called it penance. "He only wants to be pure," she said. The father answered, "Purity kills faster than sin." They did not notice their daughter listening outside the door, learning that the world's choices were never clean. At the Medici villa that evening, a banquet glimmered like temptation. Plates of sugared fruit and roasted game lined the tables. Music drifted through the courtyard, violins and laughter, indistinguishable. The duchess, radiant in emerald silk, moved between guests like a practiced breeze. The poet was there too, reciting another sonnet, this one more cautious. But caution, to the wrong ear, can sound like defiance. The Duke watched his wife's expression too long. After the applause, he placed a hand on her shoulder, light but deliberate, and the gesture said everything. Later, when the poet left, 2 guards followed him at a polite distance. Love in Florence had always been a performance. Now the actors were starting to forget which roles they'd been assigned. The poet hid for a week, the duchess avoided music, and gossip filled the silence like floodwater. Even the river seemed to carry whispers in its current. One night, lightning split the sky above Santa Croce. Rain returned, sudden and cold, washing alleys clean again. In a small house near the river, the woman who had written that first forbidden letter awoke to thunder. She rose, took her lover's reply from a drawer, and burned it over the candle. The paper curled like a living thing. When the last ember went out, she whispered a prayer not for forgiveness, but for forgetfulness. Across town, Sister Beatrice prepared to leave her convent. She packed her brushes and pigments with careful hands, wrapping them in linen as if they were relics. Before dawn, she stepped into the courtyard and looked once more at the chapel she had adorned. In its fresco, an angel still looked down at her with a face both divine and human. "Stay," she murmured. "I'll remember you." Then she walked into the dark, toward exile and silence, her shadow briefly crossing the wall like an unfinished stroke. By morning, the city awoke to rumors about the duchess's blush, the poet's disappearance, the nun's transfer. Each story changed shape with every retelling, and though no one spoke of it openly, everyone felt the same unease. That love, so carefully trained to obey, had begun to act on its own. The following morning arrived heavy with silence, the kind that makes even church bells sound cautious. The rain had ended, but the streets still glistened as though Florence were sweating through its guilt. Everywhere, shutters creaked open to let in light, and with it came the unease that follows revelation. The city had begun to suspect itself. In the marketplace, vendors whispered between transactions. Someone said the poet had been exiled. Another swore he had taken holy orders to save his soul. Someone else claimed the duchess had commissioned a painting of St. Catherine with a suspicious resemblance to herself. Rumor spread, like incense sweet, suffocating, and impossible to contain. Every word carried an aftertaste of envy and fascination. Florence could not look away from its own scandal. It found itself too beautiful, even in disgrace. At a bakery near the cathedral, the woman who once embroidered rebellion into her linens stood in line, her hands wrapped around a coin. Behind her, two merchants debated whether love or greed ruined more men. "Greed," said the first. "It's measurable." "Love," said the second. "It never ends where you expect." The woman smiled faintly, recognizing both answers as true. When her turn came, she bought not bread, but a single sweet bun, something small and warm to remind herself she could still choose pleasure for no reason at all. Farther north, in the cloister where Sister Beatrice had worked, her absence felt like a missing heartbeat. The abbess found that the new illuminator painted angels too perfectly, souls without struggle, eyes without depth. She missed the small blasphemy of Beatrice's art, though she would never admit it. That evening, during Vespers, she noticed a strange thing. One of the candles refused to stay lit, as if the flame itself were protesting the false serenity. She said nothing, but her prayers grew longer. Meanwhile, the sculptor who had carved the weary Venus found himself summoned before a council of patrons. They accused him of corrupting devotion with sensual melancholy. He listened, head bowed, while they debated whether beauty could be sinful if it reminded men of their mortality. "Isn't that the church's work?" he asked quietly. The question unsettled them. They dismissed him with a fine instead of prison, which was their way of admitting confusion. That night, he drank wine from a chipped cup and watched the rain return. "She's tired," he murmured to the statue in the corner. "And so am I." In a small room above a perfumer's shop, the woman who once burned her lover's letter began another. The ash of the old one still clung to the fireplace. This time, she wrote not to the poet but to herself. She described the scent of smoke, the taste of quiet after thunder, the way fear had begun to resemble devotion. When she sealed the page, she did not address it. She simply placed it under a vase of withered roses and left it there, a confession disguised as decoration. At the university, the young scholar who had seduced with logic now lectured on the dangers of rhetoric. His students listened, fascinated by the way he seemed to argue against himself. "Words," he said, "are the most merciful of weapons. They kill slowly." A few laughed. One took notes. None understood how much truth was bleeding beneath the irony. When he finished, he dismissed the class early, walked to the river, and threw his quill into the current. It floated briefly, then sank. The Duke's palace remained silent. The poet's name was not spoken. The Duchess's laughter no longer echoed through the halls. The Duke commissioned new tapestries, scenes of triumph and fidelity, woven thick enough to muffle whispers. But silence in Florence was never empty. It filled with memory, and memory was a stubborn guest. Servants said the Duchess stood at her window each night, watching the lanterns drift on the Arno. They said her tears glowed like pearls. Florence adored that image. It turned guilt into legend. Elsewhere, the widow who owned the bakery closed early. She swept the floor, counting each motion as penance. When she reached the doorway, she saw a boy waiting with a bouquet of violets. He offered them without speaking. She took them without smiling. The exchange was simple, meaningless, and therefore pure. It reminded her that not every gesture needed translation. As night deepened, the city's beauty grew sharp again. The moon washed over marble facades, tracing veins like pulse lines. Lovers walked under cloisters, their footsteps careful on wet stone. Some prayed, others lied. Many did both at once. From the convent to the palace, from the artist's studio to the scholar's desk, Florence glowed softly with contradiction. The sculptor dreamed of his Venus coming to life, stepping down from her pedestal and leaving fingerprints on his heart. The abbess dreamed of Sister Beatrice painting her own face on an angel's body. The Duchess dreamed of a river swallowing her reflection. And the city, restless and unsatisfied, dreamed of forgiveness it did not intend to seek. By dawn, a pale mist settled over the rooftops again. The Arno shimmered like a blade half drawn. Florence had mastered the art of appearing innocent after every sin. Yet beneath its perfume and pageantry, something had begun to shift, a tenderness no longer obedient, a desire no longer ashamed. The weapon was slipping from its master's hand. The bells of Santa Maria del Fiore rang that morning with a strange urgency, their sound too bright for the hour, too insistent for comfort. Florence woke as if startled from a fever dream. The mist that had veiled the rooftops began to lift, revealing a city that no longer recognized itself. For years, love had been Florence's most elegant disguise. It polished greed until it glittered, softened ambition with poetry, and turned every act of conquest into a sonnet. But now, the disguises were cracking. You could hear it in the markets, in the churches, in the way people began to look at each other, not with admiration, but with exhaustion. The city that once worshipped beauty had begun to suspect it might be cursed. In a chapel near the Palazzo Vecchio, a painter knelt before his unfinished fresco. The Virgin's smile, once tender, now seemed to mock him. He had spent months painting her eyes to mirror the expression of a woman he had loved in secret, one who now refused to see him. Every brushstroke had been a prayer disguised as desire, but this morning his prayers felt blasphemous. He lifted his hand to erase the line of her jaw, then stopped. What frightened him most wasn't the sin, it was the realization that the sin was beautiful. Across the city, the young scholar had locked himself away with books he could no longer bear to read. He had built his reputation on understanding the power of words, but words had betrayed him. The letter he'd once written, the one that turned affection into a weapon, had returned in whispers, copied, recited, immortalized. Now, lovers quoted his sentences as if they were scripture. He had meant to expose hypocrisy. Instead, he had invented a language for it. Florence had turned his confession into fashion. In the convent, Sister Beatrice's absence had grown into legend. Some said she was painting saints for foreign patrons. Others claimed she had died of heartbreak. The abbess, who knew only that she was gone, began to question the very purpose of silence. What good was purity, she wondered, if it erased everything human in its path? One night, She unlocked the old workshop and found a forgotten panel, an unfinished Madonna. The face was gentle, almost sorrowful. Beneath the layers of paint, faint lines revealed another sketch. A man's hand touching an angel's wing. Beatrice's secret signature. The abbess didn't destroy it. She lit a candle and watched the gold leaf shimmer like forgiveness. Meanwhile, the duchess appeared again in public. Her absence had been long enough to breed myth, her reappearance too composed to disprove it. Draped in white silk, she attended mass beside the duke, her expression carved from serenity. But when the priest spoke of temptation, her fingers tightened around her rosary until the beads left small red marks on her palm. Across the nave, an old woman watching from the crowd whispered, "She prays too hard for someone who's forgiven." The duke felt the tension too. Power, once effortless, now required constant vigilance. He began to suspect everyone, the servants, the musicians, even his confessor. One evening, he found himself alone in the gallery, staring at portraits of his ancestors. Their faces, solemn and smug, offered no comfort. Behind him, the duchess entered silently. For a moment, they simply stood side by side, their reflections shimmering in the glass of a framed painting. "Do you still love me?" he asked. It was a question he hadn't dared voice in years. She looked at him, her voice soft but unwavering. "Does anyone in this city love without a reason?" Outside, a storm gathered over the hills. The first drops of rain struck the terracotta rooftops, then fell harder, until the streets were slick and shining again. Florentines hurried for cover, clutching cloaks and secrets alike. Somewhere, the poet returned from exile or perhaps never gone watched the downpour from a tavern window. He began to write again, this time not of beauty or devotion, but of fatigue. His new verses spoke of a city that painted halos on its sinners, and then wondered why no one believed in saints. By midnight, thunder rolled across the Arno. The lightning illuminated everything: the river, the towers, the broken faiths of 1,000 hearts. In a narrow alley, two lovers met for what they promised would be the last time. Their hands trembled, not from passion, but from fear. They had been careful for years, but Florence had a way of knowing. When they parted, he whispered, "One day they'll call this love." She answered, "No, they'll call it history." In the ducal palace, sleep eluded everyone. The duke paced his study, listening to the storm. The duchess sat by the window, her rosary abandoned on the table. In the distance, the cathedral loomed, a mountain of marble rising from the darkness, beautiful, hollow, eternal. For a brief moment, lightning illuminated the fresco inside the chapel where the painter had worked. The Virgin's half-erased face glowed with ghostly light. Rainwater trickled down the wall, smudging pigment into streaks. It looked as though she were weeping. Florence slept uneasily beneath that storm, a city soaked in its own contradictions where desire passed for prayer, art disguised confession, and love was still the sharpest blade of all. The rain eased near dawn. The bells would ring again soon, calling the faithful to mass, the guilty to routine, the weary to pretend another day of beauty meant redemption. But for once, Florence did not hurry to wake. It lay quiet, drenched, and trembling, as if realizing that the very thing it had worshipped, love itself, had become the weapon it could no longer wield without bleeding. The storm had passed, but Florence did not recover. The air felt too light, as though something essential had been washed away overnight. The streets smelled of wet stone and regret. Across the city, windows opened hesitantly, as if people feared the daylight might expose what they had become. In the marketplace, merchants laid out fruit that no one bought. Painters wandered aimlessly, their commissions delayed or cancelled under the excuse of austerity. Priests gave longer sermons, warning that indulgence had infected the soul of the city. The word love was whispered now with suspicion, like a name that had fallen from grace. In the ducal palace, the duchess dressed in black. Officially, she mourned a distant cousin. Unofficially, Florence believed she mourned something else, the end of a long, dangerous illusion. The poet had disappeared completely, The Duke grew quieter with each passing day, and the courtiers learned to smile without showing their teeth. The court musicians played softer, as if afraid that melody itself might provoke confession. One afternoon, a visitor arrived at the palace, a Dominican friar with eyes too sharp for comfort. He spoke in the tone of prophecy, warning of God's wrath against a city ruled by vanity and sin. The Duke, weary and restless, welcomed him as a novelty. The Duchess did not. She recognized the type, men who mistook fear for holiness. Yet even she found herself trembling when he spoke of fire and purification. His voice carried the rhythm of certainty, and certainty in an age of doubt was seductive. Within weeks, the friar's sermons spread through Florence like an epidemic. He preached from the cathedral steps, his voice rising over the crowd like a storm rekindled. "You build your palaces on desire," he thundered. "You paint your sins and call them miracles. You pray not to God, but to beauty, and beauty will destroy you." People listened, not because they believed, but because they wanted to. Faith had become another form of exhaustion, and this man offered an ending. Artisans burned sketches they once worshipped. Women covered their mirrors. Lovers stopped writing letters. Even the river seemed to flow more quietly, as if ashamed to reflect so much splendor. Sister Beatrice, hearing of these sermons in her countryside convent, felt the tremor of fear even there. She had thought exile would free her from Florence's temptations, but now the same language of judgment reached her cloister walls. One evening, she painted a final panel, a storm over the city she had left behind. In its center stood a single figure, faceless and alone. When the abbess found it, she asked, "Who is this?" Beatrice answered, "Everyone." In the city, bonfires began. They called them bonfires of vanities, a cleansing of Florence's soul. People threw perfumes, dresses, playing cards, manuscripts, even paintings into the flames. Children sang hymns while the smoke darkened the sky. The poet's surviving pages burned too, their words curling into ash. Watching from her window, the Duchess whispered, "We are purifying ourselves of ourselves." The Duke, meanwhile, found strange comfort in the friar's certainty. He began to attend sermons in secret, disguised among the crowd. The preacher spoke of sin, but what the Duke heard was power, a way to rule through fear instead of love. That night, he summoned his advisors and ordered new decrees: stricter dress, fewer festivals, no music after dusk. Florence would be pure again, or at least obedient. The decree spread quickly. The sculptor, who had once carved beauty into rebellion, found his workshop sealed. His statues were deemed indecent, too lifelike, too human. He protested, and the guards told him quietly, "The city has no room for longing anymore." Yet longing, like water, finds cracks. Behind closed doors, lovers met in silence, their kisses brief but desperate, as if each might be the last. The Duchess too found herself haunted by memory. She dreamt of her poet, not his face, but his voice, reading verses about love as a weapon and truth as its wound. She woke one night and went to the window. Down below, the piazza glowed with fire. She thought of stepping outside, of walking into the crowd and confessing everything. Instead, she closed the shutters and knelt to pray. The words came slowly, uncertainly. "Forgive us," she whispered, "for what we made holy." By dawn, Florence was unrecognizable. The city that once sang with color now moved in shades of gray. The perfume of roses had been replaced by smoke. Painters began to flee north, to Venice, to Milan, places still tolerant of pleasure. Those who stayed painted saints without eyes and angels without mouths. But silence, even when enforced, does not last. One morning, graffiti appeared on the church wall. "Even God wept for what we burned." No one knew who wrote it, but everyone read it. For the first time in months, the Duchess smiled. At the convent, Sister Beatrice packed her brushes again. She had finished her storm painting and felt no peace. Instead, she heard whispers in the wind, the sound of Florence calling her back. The city was suffering, and somewhere in her, despite everything, she still loved it. That night, under a sky clear and cruelly calm, she began her journey home. Florence waited, quiet but trembling. Its beauty had survived plague, war, and corruption. But could it survive its own repentance? The bells would answer soon. Morning in Florence arrived like an apology. The sky was washed pale, the streets still smelled faintly of smoke, and the bells of Santa Maria del Fiore rang with an almost nervous hesitation, as if unsure whether to summon worshippers or warn them. The bonfires had burned through the night. Where once the air smelled of oil paint and incense, now it reeked of ash and wet parchment. What had been beautiful was gone, and what remained was obedience. The friar stood on the cathedral steps again, his hands lifted toward the crowd, the smoke of their sacrifices swirling around him like a crown. "Behold," he cried, "Florence reborn, purified, humbled, chosen." But as the crowd cheered, the sound carried no joy. It was relief, thin and trembling, the way a fever patient thanks the doctor holding the knife. From the balcony of the ducal palace, the duchess watched the flames die out, the embers still pulsing like a heartbeat refusing to stop. The friar's voice reached her window. Chosen. The word clung to her skin. Chosen for what? Salvation or spectacle? She turned from the window and found the Duke standing behind her, cloaked in dark velvet. "Do you believe him?" she asked. The Duke's expression was unreadable. "I believe in control," he said softly. "And if fear restores it, then perhaps fear is holy." She said nothing. The silence between them was heavier than the smoke. In that silence, Florence itself seemed to hold its breath. Down in the city, painters dismantled their studios, sculptors buried their unfinished works, and poets tore up their manuscripts before the next purge could claim them. Art, the city's oldest confession, had become contraband. Yet everywhere, small rebellions flickered like the dying embers of a fire that refused to go out. A baker carved tiny hearts into loaves of bread and sold them at dawn, pretending they were meaningless. A tailor stitched secret patterns into the lining of women's dresses' curves, flowers, forbidden beauty hidden against the skin. And in the convent on the hill, Sister Beatrice painted again. She returned to Florence in secret, travelling by night and slipping through the city's narrow alleys until she reached her old workshop. The walls were cracked, the air thick with dust, but her brushes still lay where she had left them. She lit a candle and began to work, her hand trembling not from fear, but from hunger, hunger for colour, for life, for truth. She painted not saints, but people. The baker's weary smile, the tailor's hidden embroidery, the faces of women whose laughter had been exiled from the streets. It was the Florence she remembered not holy, but human. And though she painted in silence, every stroke was an act of defiance. One evening, a stranger sea aimed to her door. A cloaked man, face shadowed. He set down a parcel wrapped in linen. "From the Duchess," he said. "She asks for a portrait not of herself, but of Florence." Beatrice unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a single rose, its petals bruised, and a gold coin stamped with the Duke's seal. She understood immediately. It was not a commission, it was a plea. Days passed. In the palace, the Duchess grew pale. She no longer attended mass or meals. The Duke mistook her silence for devotion. He did not see that it was grief. She had watched the city destroy the very thing that made it divine its capacity to love. Outside her window, the friar's sermons grew more frenzied. He spoke of apocalypse now, of angels with swords of fire, of cleansing not just of sin, but of sinners. The people trembled. They had been promised salvation, but what they felt was terror, and terror, like love, is contagious. In the taverns, whispers began. The friar had become a tyrant, the Duke his puppet. The same citizens who once shouted "Amen" now muttered curses under their breath. Even the priests began to waver. One night, a young novice stood before the friar's pulpit and asked, "If God made beauty, why must we burn it?" The friar's hand trembled. "Because beauty tempts," he said. "Then so does life," the novice replied. The crowd gasped. The friar struck him across the face. That single blow spread through Florence faster than fire. By the next week, the bonfires had ceased. The city that once wept for its sin now seethed with doubt. Painters began to paint again quietly, cautiously. On small wooden panels they hid beneath their beds. Lovers met in gardens after curfew, whispering verses remembered from burned books. Even the bakers' hearts grew bolder, carved deep enough to be unmistakable. Florence was remembering itself. In her workshop, Sister Beatrice completed the Duchess's commission. The painting was not a portrait in the usual sense. It showed the city as a woman kneeling, veiled, hands clasped in prayer, but if you looked closely, the prayer was not submission. It was defiance disguised as devotion. When the Duchess saw it, she wept. "It's too beautiful," she whispered. "They'll destroy it." "Then let them try," Beatrice said. And for the first time in months, the Duchess laughed a sound quiet, fierce, and alive. That night, thunder rolled over the hills again, but no one was afraid. In the darkness, Florence began to breathe differently. The fear that had choked it for months was lifting, replaced by something sharper, older, and truer. Love had returned not as a whisper or a weapon, but as resistance. The first open act of defiance came not from a soldier or a noble, but from a painter. He was young, reckless, and already ruined by reputation, a former apprentice who had once been beaten for sketching a woman's ankle. On the Feast of St. Mark, he climbed the scaffolding of the city hall and painted over the Duke's official mural. What had once been a triumphant image of Florence kneeling before God was now something else entirely. A woman standing upright, naked but unashamed, her gaze turned not toward heaven, but toward the people watching her. By dawn, the whole city had gathered in the square. Some gasped, some prayed, and some simply stared. The friar's followers rushed forward to scrape away the blasphemy, but the paint would not come off. It was oil-based, defiant as the city's memory. The image remained a reflection of everything Florence had tried to forget about itself. From her balcony, the Duchess saw it too. For the first time in months, sunlight seemed to touch her face without judgment. The woman in the painting was Florence itself. Beautiful, unrepentant, alive. The friar was furious. He declared the act a direct challenge to divine order. His sermons became darker, almost desperate. "Temptation has returned among us," he cried. "The devil walks again through the streets, wearing the face of desire." But this time, fewer people listened. His words had lost their spell. Even those who still feared him began to notice the tremor in his voice, the exhaustion behind his certainty. The Duke tried to maintain control. He ordered the painting covered with a velvet drape, but every night someone removed it. Every morning it reappeared, cleaner and brighter than before, as though the very air was protecting it. The rumor spread that the Duchess herself ordered her servants to keep it uncovered. She never confirmed it, but neither did she deny it. The city began to change again, quietly at first. The taverns filled with laughter, the poets whispered verses in candlelit corners, and the scent of paint returned to the streets. The people were rediscovering pleasure, not indulgence, but relief. After months of silence, even sin felt like breathing. In the convent, Sister Beatrice heard the news of the mural and smiled. She had painted her truth in secret. Now others were doing it in daylight. Florence was waking. The fear that had cloaked it like incense was thinning. That evening, she returned to her workshop and began a new painting larger than any she had attempted before. It showed a procession of figures, lovers, sinners, saints, and beggars, all walking side by side toward the rising sun. There was no hierarchy, no shame, no judgment, only motion, only life. As she worked, she realized that Florence itself was her subject, the city as a body, the body as a prayer. She painted for nights without sleep, the candlelight flickering against the wet varnish until her hands ached. Meanwhile, unrest grew in the streets. The friars' guards patrolled with torches, tearing down murals, arresting painters, raiding studios. But every time a work was destroyed, two more appeared. Walls bloomed with color overnight. Statues re-emerged from hidden gardens. It was as if the city itself had chosen rebellion. The duchess too began to act. She opened her private gallery and filled it with forbidden works, paintings once burned, sculptures once condemned. She invited no one, but everyone knew. It was a declaration without words, that beauty was not sin, that love was not shame, that the soul of Florence belonged to no priest or duke. The duke confronted her one evening. "You're inviting ruin," he said, voice low, eyes hard. She met his gaze. "No," she answered. "I'm inviting Florence to remember what it was before men like you forgot." He struck the table, sending a goblet spilling across the marble. The wine spread like blood. "You're destroying the order that holds this city together." She stood. It was never order, it was fear dressed as virtue. They stared at each other for a long time, two halves of a city that no longer fit together. Outside, the people were already gathering. Artists, apprentices, merchants, women with painted lips and uncovered hair. They sang no hymns. They carried no banners. They simply stood before the cathedral, looking up at the fresco of judgment above the doors, and began to sing an old love song that everyone had once known. It echoed across the piazza, soft at first, then louder, until even the friars' guards lowered their torches to listen. The sound filled the night not of defiance, but of memory. It was the voice of a city reclaiming its breath. When dawn came, the mural of the naked woman still stood, untouched. But beside it, someone had painted new words. "In gold beauty is not the sin. Fear is." By the time the friar arrived, the crowd had already dispersed. Only the words remained, gleaming in the early light. And in her workshop, Sister Beatrice stepped back from her finished painting, tears streaking her face. She whispered to the silent room, "It's done." But Florence was not done. It was only beginning again. Years passed, and Florence changed the way spring changes a garden. It did not happen all at once, but everything that had been scorched began to bloom again. The city had grown quieter, wiser, softer in its defiance. There were still sermons, still rules, still whispers of sin and salvation. But beneath them pulsed something deeper, a steady, patient heartbeat. It was the sound of a city that had finally learned how to forgive itself. The great mural still stood in the square. The woman Florence herself remained untouched by time, her golden gaze unbroken. Rain had dulled the colours a little, and moss had begun to creep along the edges, but people said it made her look alive, as though she was breathing with them. Lovers met beneath her eyes, children played in her shadow, and even old men, those who had once shouted for the friars' purges, now paused before her to bow their heads not in fear, but in quiet understanding. The duchess had aged, though the years treated her gently. She spent her mornings walking through the gardens where wild roses grew unchecked, her hands brushing the petals like old friends. Sometimes, she would stop at the fountain, where she could see her reflection in the rippling water, the same face that had once stared down an empire of fear. Behind her eyes lived both pride and melancholy, the bittersweet cost of surviving what others could not. One afternoon, a young painter approached her in the garden. He was shy, carrying a small wooden panel wrapped in linen. "My lady," he said, bowing low, "I was told you once sat for a portrait by Sister Beatrice." The duchess smiled faintly. "Yes. She captured my city better than she ever captured my face." "I have seen her paintings," the young man said. "They are different. There is something in them, something that feels like truth." "Then keep that," she said. Truth will cost you everything, but it will make your soul worth saving. He nodded, though he did not yet understand. He left her there, beneath the orange trees, the scent of blossoms thick in the air. That evening, the Duchess climbed the steps of the cathedral one last time. The bells rang the hour, their tones soft and low. She looked out over the city, her city, and for a moment, it seemed that all of Florence was holding its breath with her. She thought of the friar, of the flames, of the fear that had once silenced beauty. She thought of Beatrice, who had painted truth when it was forbidden to speak it. She thought of love, not the kind written in poetry, but the kind that rebuilds after ruin. When she descended, she walked through the square and stopped before the mural. The golden woman's face caught the last of the sunlight. "You survived us all," the Duchess whispered. "And that is how I know Florence will never die." A small crowd had gathered behind her without her noticing. Merchants, painters, mothers, beggars, lovers. None spoke. They stood together in the fading light, united not by prayer, but by memory. The Duchess turned to them and said quietly, "Protect her." They nodded. She smiled once more, then disappeared into the evening crowd. Decades later, long after her death, travellers to Florence would still ask about the painting. Some said it was a symbol of blasphemy, others, a miracle. But the locals would only smile and say, "It's not a painting. It's who we were when we finally remembered who we are." They would tell stories about a duchess who defied her husband, a nun who painted truth, and a city that once mistook love for sin until love became its salvation. Children grew up hearing those tales, not as history, but as lullabies whispered before sleep, whispered. And somewhere, beyond the river, in a forgotten convent, a single candle burned beside Beatrice's final canvas. It showed Florence not as a place, but as a heart open, wounded, radiant. Beneath it, in faint gold letters, she had written her last prayer. "Love is not a sin. Forgetting it is." The candle flickered. Outside, the bells began to ring again, not in warning, but in joy. And so Florence, the city that once used love as a weapon, became the city that proved love could heal even the deepest wounds. If you listened carefully, even centuries later, you could still hear its heartbeat in the cobblestones, in the laughter by the river, in every brushstroke that dared to capture what cannot be owned. Because Florence had finally learned that love, like art, cannot be commanded, it can only be remembered. And remembering, after all, is how we remain alive.